Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we are attempting something pretty massive. We're going right back to the source, to the original blueprints of Buddhist thought.
Right.
We're not looking at what Buddhism became over, 2,000 years.
Right.
We're trying to examine the precise, almost clinical framework that was laid out in its earliest days.
Exactly. And for that, we're digging into some foundational texts. Things like the Sayutta Nikaya, the linked discourses, and this is really critical, the poetry of the Therigatha.
The verses of the senior nuns, which are just, incredible.
They're incredible, and that's really the mission here. When you start to look at this material, especially when you cross-reference these texts,
Yeah.
what you find isn't some, vague spiritual philosophy.
No, not at all.
It's a complex, highly integrated philosophical system. It's built on this rigorous, step-by-step logic that details the mechanics of suffering and, more importantly, how to end it.
So our job today in this deep dive is to sort of reconcile the, let's say, the popular modern views of the practice with what these original sources actually say.
And that's where it gets interesting, because there are some real disconnects.
Okay, and that brings us to the big surprise nugget you mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
Because when you do that comparison, modern interpretation versus ancient blueprint, you hit a wall pretty fast.
You really do.
In the world today, the buzzword is mindfulness, right?
Yeah.
It's sold as the direct path to everything. Stress reduction, focus, enlightenment, you name it.
It's the cure-all.
But the traditional structure, the one we find in these discourses, it suggests that conventional wisdom might be, well, skipping a huge, crucial step.
It's almost an inversion of the process, and that changes everything about how you'd actually approach the practice. So our goal today is to provide some real clarity on that central progressive path.
And to do that, we need to get very precise with the language.
We have to. We need to define the core concepts that act as the engine of suffering and rebirth. We're talking about terms like choices, craving, and grasping.
And then we have to spend some real time with the voices of the first liberated women.
Absolutely. Their stories, their poems, they aren't just, historical footnotes. They're primary evidence of spiritual equality and attainment. Fierce, funny, fearless narratives.
I love that. Okay, let's unpack this blueprint. And I think we have to start with what you've called the mindfulness paradox. Because, like you said, it kind of flips the whole path on its head.
It really does. So the central tension we found is all about the relationship between three things: mindfulness, serenity, and insight.
Right.
Now, in almost all contemporary, westernized discussions, Satipatthana mindfulness is presented as the fast track. It's the direct route to vipassana, or insight.
Right. The instruction is basically just be aware, watch things as they are, and poof, insight will happen.
That's the popular model. But what do the earliest source texts tell us?
I'm guessing something very different.
Very different. They show that the relationship is way more specific and sequenced than we usually assume.
Yeah.
When you do a really close study of the hundreds of discourses in the Sayutta Nikaya, a startling fact emerges.
Which is?
The teachings that are specifically about insight, about vipassana, they very rarely even mention mindfulness or satipatthana.
That's strange.
It's very strange, given the modern emphasis. And conversely, the teachings that do focus on mindfulness, they tend to emphasize that its direct result, what you're cultivating, is samatha.
Serenity, tranquility.
Exactly.
Okay, hold on. Let me make sure I'm getting this right, because that really is a radical inversion. If mindfulness leads to serenity, are you saying that anyone trying to practice insight without first achieving a really deep mental stability is, well, they're missing the key ingredient?
That is precisely what the blueprint implies. Insight, in this original context, it's not just a clever idea or a brief moment of clarity.
It's not an aha moment.
No, it's a deep, unwavering penetration of reality. It's seeing things exactly as they are without distortion. And to sustain that kind of deep seeing, especially against the constant barrage of our conditioned minds, you need the profound stability of mind that's called samadhi, or jhana. Deep absorption.
So without that stable, purified platform of serenity, my attempts at insight would just get, swept away by the next thought or emotion.
Absolutely. The mind can't discern these really subtle, universal truths like impermanence or not self if it's constantly being rocked by even subtle mental turbulence.
It's like trying to see your reflection in a choppy lake.
Perfect analogy. You're trying to read microscopic details on the surface of water during a storm. You need the water to be absolutely still. It's serenity, this deep, immersive peace that acts as the catalyst for liberating insight. They work together, but the sources are insistent on the sequence. Serenity first, then insight.
And the sources even get into the mechanics of this, don't they? They describe this progressive stilling of the mind as you go deeper into these states of immersion, these jhanas.
They do. This isn't abstract stuff. It's a clinical roadmap of your own inner experience. For instance, the Buddha teaches that when you attain the first absorption, the first jhana, speech has stilled.
Meaning you're not thinking in words anymore.
Right, verbal thought just stops. It's replaced by a much more subtle mental application. Then, as you move deeper into the second absorption, applied and sustained thought themselves have stilled.
So even that subtle mental activity is gone.
It's gone. By the third, joy has stilled. By the fourth, even pleasure and pain have stilled. You're left with this pure, perfect equanimity. It's a progressive shutdown of all the internal noise that keeps us tied to our usual reality.
And it goes even further than that.
It does. The highest states of absorption lead to the stilling of conditions up to the point where even perception and feeling temporarily cease. It's this absolute non-reactive stability that allows the mind, when it emerges, to finally see the nature of things without immediately grasping or reacting or getting swept away.
Okay, this brings us to a really key distinction in terms, because it sounds like we're using the word mindfulness in two very different ways, and modern practice seems to mush them together.
Yes, that's a huge point of confusion. The source material is very clear about the distinction between two Pali terms, Satipatthana and Sampajanya.
Okay, break those down for us.
The first one, mindfulness meditation, Satipatthana, refers strictly to the formal practice. This is the time you set aside, usually in seclusion, to sit down and do the work of establishing mindfulness with the aim of generating that deep serenity we just talked about.
So that's the on-the-cushion practice. What about the awareness we're told to have all day long? You know, while washing the dishes or walking down the street.
That is situational awareness, or sampajanya. That's what's typically called mindfulness in daily life. The texts describe it as being aware when you're going out and coming back, looking ahead and looking aside, when you're eating, drinking, walking, speaking.
So one is formal training, the other is real-world application.
Sort of. The sources teach that sampajanya is essential. It's the groundwork. It purifies your conduct. It prepares the mind for the really rigorous formal practice of deep meditation, the satipatthana, but they are distinct. You have to cultivate that daily situational awareness to make the formal practice possible, but it's the formal practice that ultimately gives you the serenity you need for insight.
I really appreciate that clarification. It changes the Noble Eightfold Path from, just a list of virtues into a very clear, progressive curriculum. It's a course you have to follow in order.
It's a blueprint for guaranteed success, but only if you follow it precisely. And it doesn't start with meditation, which is another common misconception. It starts with the intellectual and ethical foundation.
Walk us through that progression then. How do the sources connect these seemingly separate parts of the path?
Okay, so the path begins with hearing the teaching. Understanding the four core truths, that's right view, that's the intellectual starting point.
Knowing the lay of the land.
Exactly, and that initial wisdom immediately tells you that you need to develop ethical purity, or sila. That covers right thought, right speech, right action, and right livelihood. This ethical foundation is non-negotiable.
Why so strict on that point?
Because the texts are explicit. Without ethical purity, any attempt at mental purification is impossible. Any concentration you develop on a foundation of, say, lying or harming others will be superficial. It'll be unstable.
That makes perfect sense. I mean, you can't get your mind truly still if you're constantly agitated or worried about the consequences of your own bad actions.
Precisely. So once that ethical purity, sila, is established, then you move to the concentration factors. That's the final three steps. Right effort, right mindfulness, the formal practice, satipatthana, and finally right immersion, which is samasamadhi, the attainment of those four deep absorptions, the jhanas.
And this clear step-by-step course helps a person not get overwhelmed by all the other lists in the teachings, right? Like the famous 37 qualities leading to awakening.
Yes, that was a point in the critique that needed fleshing out. How do these 37 qualities just map onto the Eightfold Path? It's crucial to see that these lists aren't competing systems. They're just detailing the same path from different angles, often using synonyms.
Okay, can you give an example of that? How does one of the 37 fit in?
Sure. Let's take right effort from the Eightfold Path. It's defined very specifically as the effort to prevent bad mental states from arising, abandon the ones that have arisen, cultivate good ones, and maintain the good ones you've got.
It's the engine of mental housekeeping.
That's a great way to put it. Now look at another list, one of the four bases for psychic power. One of those bases is the faculty of striving, or effort, that's coupled with concentration. The sources define this striving in the exact same way: preventing, abandoning, cultivating, maintaining.
Ah, I see. So it's the same psychological function,
Yeah.
just with a different label.
Exactly. The power, the success, it doesn't come from some kind of magic. It comes from dedicating yourself to these foundational efforts. The language might change. Sometimes wisdom is called investigation of principles, sometimes inquiry, sometimes just right view. But the function is the same. The 37 qualities are just the detailed breakdown of the skills you need for morality, concentration, and wisdom. It's all seamlessly integrated.
So the Eightfold Path is the high-level summary, and the 37 qualities are the detailed operational manual. I get it. So once that mind is purified, once it's absolutely stable through this deep serenity, what does it look at? What's the object of its gaze?
The deep mechanics of why we suffer. And that takes us right into the heart of Buddhist philosophy: dependent origination. Dependent origination, or Do, is really the philosophical engine of early Buddhism. It's unique because the Buddha identified it as the middle teaching.
Middle, meaning it avoids certain philosophical traps. What were those traps?
There were two big ones causing a lot of confusion at the time. The first one was about moral responsibility and the self. Philosophers were debating, is the person who does a deed, the very same person who experiences the result in a future life?
Or were they a completely different person?
Exactly. The eternalist view said they're identical. A permanent soul just travels from body to body. The nihilist view said they're completely different, which basically makes moral action meaningless.
And the Buddha rejected both of those.
He rejected both. Dido provides the middle path by showing that the person is neither identical nor different. There's continuity, a causal process. The deed creates an effect that propels consciousness forward. But there's no permanent thing, no soul that makes the leap.
It's a process, not a person.
A process, not a person. And the second set of extremes was about existence itself. The idea that everything exists in some permanent way, or that nothing exists and everything just gets wiped out at death.
Eternalism versus annihilationism.
Right. And again, Dido avoids this by showing that existence isn't a fixed state. It's a continuous process of conditions leading to a conditioned result. Nothing exists on its own, but nothing is totally annihilated either. Our current conscious body, this experience right now, arose because of ignorance and craving in a past life.
And realizing that whole chain of cause and effect, that's the key to insight.
That's the opening. And to really understand that chain, the sources give these incredibly precise definitions for the key links, the ones that really drive rebirth. Let's start with choices.
Or sakkara. This is a famously tricky word to translate.
It is, but in this context, it refers very specifically to intentional moral acts: good, bad, or neutral, things you do with your body, your speech, or your mind. The Pali word literally means to put together or construct. These choices are the forces, the energies that condition and propel consciousness toward the next life.
And often we're not even aware we're doing it. It's born out of ignorance.
Totally. The source material gives the example of a Vedic ritual. That whole complex ceremony is a sakkara. It's a constructed activity that is intended to produce a good result in the future. It's the intentional action that creates the momentum for what happens next.
Okay, so choice is the engine that gets the whole thing moving. But that movement is immediately hijacked by something more primal: craving.
Exactly. The next link is craving, or tanha. This is the raw primal instinct. It's defined as the desire for the 6 kinds of sense stimuli: sights, sounds, smells, tastes, touches, and mental objects.
And this is the craving from the Four Noble Truths.
The very same. Craving for sensual pleasures, craving to keep existing, and even craving to stop existing. It's that automatic, gut-level push and pull in response to everything we experience.
So if choices are the momentum, craving is the raw appetite that steers it. But then it gets more sophisticated, more uniquely human. It matures into grasping.
Grasping, upadana, and the sources are very clear that this is more complex and, in a way, more dangerous than just raw craving, because grasping requires thought. It requires language.
How so?
Grasping attaches to 4 things. It attaches to sensual pleasures, like craving does, but also to views, religious observances, and theories of self. This is where we start building an intellectual case for our desires.
Okay, so craving is the raw, I want that cookie. Grasping is when we develop a whole philosophy about why we deserve the cookie, why it's a good cookie, and how our identity is tied to being a cookie eater.
That is an excellent way to put it. Grasping is the justification. And because it requires that conceptual thought, the text suggests that's why mature humans perform the deeds with the weightiest karmic consequences. An animal or a small child can crave, but they don't grasp at complex views or theories of self.
So grasping is what really fuels the next life, what leads to suffering.
It's the stage that directly fuels continued existence, which the texts call bhava, and that inevitably leads to birth, death, and all the suffering in between.
So to dismantle all that, you have to understand not just the chain of causality, but the very components of experience that we're grasping onto in the first place. This is where the five aggregates, the khandhas, come in.
Right. The five aggregates: form, feeling, perception, choices, and consciousness are the sum total of our conditioned experience. There's nothing in your experience that falls outside of these five categories, and the goal of the path is to understand them so completely that the mind just lets go.
And the core insight you're supposed to have about them is their universal impermanence.
Universal and absolute. The Buddha's language here is completely uncompromising. He says there is no aggregate, not the body, not feelings, not thoughts, and critically, not even consciousness itself, that is permanent, everlasting, eternal, imperishable. All of it is impermanent. All of it is a source of suffering, and all of it is perishable.
So the whole point of this philosophical heavy lifting is to achieve this radical sense of detachment from, well, from everything you think of as you.
Yes. The path to freedom is realizing over and over that all five of these things are not mine. I am not this. This is not myself. And the sources show this is a direct cause and effect relationship. When an ordinary person mistakenly thinks their body is their self, and then that body gets old and sick, which it must, that gives rise to sorrow, pain, and distress.
Grasping leads to anxiety. Not grasping leads to freedom from anxiety.
It's an immediate, verifiable psychological law.
And this really cuts the legs out from under the idea that consciousness is some kind of permanent soul or spirit.
It's designed to surgically remove that idea. The texts state that consciousness is fundamentally dependent. You can't even describe consciousness arising or growing apart from form, feeling, perception, and choices. Consciousness is supported by, it's fueled by, it's grounded on our choices, our sakhara.
What does that mean in a practical sense?
It means if you intend something or plan something or have some deep-seated habit, that intention acts as a support for consciousness to continue. When that support is there, consciousness gets established, it grows, and that leads to the start of the next life.
But if you remove the support,
If a practitioner has, through this whole process, given up greed for form, for feeling, for all of it, then those supports are gone. There's no foundation for consciousness to land on.
so the continuation consciousness isn't the default state. It actually requires fuel and a foundation. If you remove the fuel, which is craving, and you dismantle the foundation, seeing the aggregates as a self, the fire just goes out.
That's it. When the fuel is cut off, the mind achieves what's called the unshakable release. And that's why when the Buddha was asked what happens to a liberated person after death, he said you can't describe them in terms of existing or not existing. The concepts just don't apply anymore.
Okay, so we've gone from the microscopic analysis of the self to the macroscopic. Let's talk about the cosmos, because the sources provide this huge, rich context for the whole spiritual struggle.
That framing is so important. As the source material points out, these aren't just, dry historical documents. They're a form of sacred story, a myth that conveys timeless spiritual truths and helps you find your place in this vast reality.
A reality filled with gods and demons and immense stretches of time.
Right. And what makes the Buddhist perspective so unique is its radical demotion of divinity.
The gods are still there, but their job description has changed.
Profoundly. In earlier traditions, the gods, the devas, were often seen as infallible, as the ultimate moral standard. In these Buddhist texts, they are completely caught up in the cycle of suffering, in samsara. They don't inspire humans, they're often foolish, they're subject to fear, and they frequently need to be taught by the Buddha.
They're getting schooled, as you said.
Constantly. There's a great story about Baka the divinity.
Tell me about him.
Baka had reached this very high, very long-lived heavenly realm, and in his pride he declared that his realm was permanent, everlasting, eternal. The Buddha just appears before him and rebukes him, pointing out his delusion. That which is conditioned must pass away.
So the texts use the magnificence of the gods to show the ultimate worthlessness of even the highest worldly states when compared to liberation.
Exactly. Even gods get old, die, and get reborn. Even they are ultimately afraid. And this just dramatically raises the stakes for human life. We're not looking up to the gods for salvation. In a way, we're looking down on their predicament.
The human realm is the critical opportunity. And this whole struggle is personified by one figure in particular, Mara the Wicked.
Mara the Terminator. The fisherman, he's the cosmic obstacle, the primary tempter.
And his goal is simple: keep everyone trapped in the cycle. Stop the Buddha from teaching.
Right. His central strategies are, 1, trying to convince the Buddha to just stay quiet after his enlightenment, and 2, specifically targeting trainees, especially the nuns, with fear and terror and a kind of cosmic gaslighting.
But the texts reveal his most potent weapon, the one that traps even advanced practitioners, isn't something obvious like lust or hate.
No, it's far more subtle and much more relevant to life within a spiritual community. The most brutal obstacle is identified as possessions, honor, and popularity.
Spiritual success, basically.
The texts are brutal about this. They call these 3 desires brutal, bitter, and harsh. This is Mara's ultimate hook, because these desires can so easily masquerade as something skillful. A monk with a big following, lots of donations, lots of honor. He looks successful, but the source says this is a major obstacle to reaching the supreme sanctuary from the yoke.
Wow. That is an ancient warning against the celebrity guru phenomena.
It is precisely that. The desire for social validation and worldly gain, even within a supposedly renounced life, is seen as fundamentally corrupting. And the sources use a couple of really striking similes to hammer this point home.
Let's hear them. What's the simile of the bird?
This simile illustrates the complete spiritual ruin that this kind of greed can cause. A monastic whose mind gets overcome by possessions, honor, and popularity is compared to a little bird that flies into a gale force wind. Its feet go one way, its wings go another, it's flung about violently, it loses all its direction, and ultimately it loses all its belongings and ends up returning to a lesser life. It symbolizes a total loss of the path, a regression. The internal stability you've worked so hard for is just shattered by this chaotic desire for social approval.
That's a powerful image. And what about the mother test? That sounds even more jarring.
It is. The
Yeah.
Buddha says he has known a person whose ethical standards were so high that they would not tell a deliberate lie even to save their own mother.
That's the gold standard of integrity.
It's the gold standard. Yet the Buddha observes that same person at a later time telling a deliberate lie. Why? Because their mind had been completely overwhelmed by the desire for possessions, honor, and popularity.
So the desire for spiritual status was more corrupting than even the love for one's own mother.
That's what the text says. This desire for the world's pretty things is how Mara sets his trap. And the urgency of escaping that trap is just underscored by the immense scale of time and suffering that these texts describe.
Right, through these cosmological similes. They're designed to make you feel the depth of our entanglement.
You really are. Take the simile of the mother's milk. To try and convey the cumulative suffering across the beginningless past, the Buddha says that the amount of mother's milk an individual has drunk while just roaming from life to life is more than the water in the 4 oceans.
Wait, say that again. More than the water in all 4 oceans.
Yeah, true.
That's not just poetry. That's designed to completely reframe your sense of self and time.
It's meant to shock you into action, to make you confront this almost infinite loop we've been stuck in. And the time scale is just as mind-boggling. To describe the length of one eon, one kalpa, the Buddha uses the simile of the eon and the sesame seed.
I think I remember this one.
You picture a huge cart filled with 20 bushels of sesame seeds. Then someone comes along and removes just one single seed every 100 years.
Every century, one tiny seed.
Mm-hmm.
That is excruciatingly slow.
The time it would take to empty that entire cart of seeds would be shorter than the lifespan in just one of the hells, the Pink Lotus hell. The message is crystal clear. The cycle is unimaginably long. The danger is not a distant threat. It's right here, right now. And a successful human life dedicated to the spiritual project is therefore the most important activity in the entire cosmos. It's the one chance to escape time itself.
Okay, so from that macro scale of gods and eons, we have to bring it back down to the personal, to the people who actually use this blueprint to escape that immense trap.
Yes, we have to shift to the intensely personal, vibrant, and incredibly valuable voices of the early female practitioners. We find them in the Therigatha, the verses of the senior nuns.
This collection is so important. It's primary evidence for what the spiritual lives of the first nuns, the bhikkhunis, were actually like.
And the analysis points out something crucial. The text definitely foregrounds women's experiences, and it even talks about suffering that's specifically due to gender discrimination. But their voices aren't constrained by our modern agendas. They're speaking from a place of incredible spiritual authority that they achieved by following this path.
The tone is described as vibrant, proud, and celebratory.
It is. These women were not shy about what they had accomplished. They were establishing their spiritual equality with men and openly pushing back against every limitation, social, personal, and even cosmic, like confronting Mara head on.
The classic example of that is the nun Soma and her takedown of Mara's sexism. Tell us that story.
So Mara, playing the cosmic gaslighter, comes to her and says, basically, how could you, a woman, possibly attain the state of the sages? A woman's mind is just too weak for that.
Wow.
And her response is just magnificent. First, she instantly recognizes him. She has the insight to see through his disguise. And then she just fearlessly refutes him.
What'd you say?
She challenges him directly. She says, what difference does womanhood make when the mind is serene and knowledge is present as you rightly discern the Dhamma? She's basically saying the enlightened mind has no gender. She'd already attained the goal, which made his whole attack completely irrelevant.
That's incredible. Another really powerful example of claiming that authority is the nun Bada Kapilani.
Right. Fada had been the wife of Kassapa, who was one of the Buddha's most respected disciples. And in her verses, she starts by praising her former husband for his incredible attainments. But she doesn't stop there.
Where's she at?
She then boldly asserts that she has realized the exact same supreme, unshakable attainments. She isn't trying to get validation through him. She's stating a fact. The fact of her perfect spiritual equality. It's a moment of profound, earned pride.
And these verses just make the whole journey so relatable because of the specific, visceral details of their past lives. Let's talk about Mutta.
Buddha's liberation verse is famous for its directness and its humor. She celebrates being freed from the three things that humped me: the mortar, the pestle, and my humpbacked husband.
That is incredibly blunt.
It's a very compact statement of freedom. The commentary notes that the mortar and pestle, these tools of relentless back-breaking housework, would literally deform a woman's body, making her crooked.
And my humpbacked husband.
Well, the analysis suggests this brilliant double entendre. Her husband was literally a hunchback, but the phrase also points to the demanding nature of a spouse, the burden of domestic and sexual duties that were just part of life for women then. A burden that makes you feel spiritually crooked or weighed down. Her joy is about escaping all of it, the physical toil and the spiritual constraints.
Then you have the almost unbelievable story of Ambapali, the wealthy courtesan, who uses her own aging body as proof of the teaching.
Amapali was a legend in her time, famed for her beauty, her wealth, her influence, so her decision to become a nun would have been a huge scandal, and her verse, which she wrote decades later, is this unflinching description of her body's decay. She turns what was once her greatest asset into her greatest tool for insight.
She gets very specific, doesn't she?
Incredibly specific. She notes how her breasts, once swelling, round, close, and perky, now droop like water bags. Her neck, once like a polished shell of conch, is now bowed and bent. And she's not lamenting this. She is achieving insight by radically and honestly observing physical decay. The loss of her beauty becomes the ultimate confirmation of the Buddha's words.
Her liberation comes through her past, not in spite of it.
Exactly. And then there's the moment of Pakara's awakening. This is a perfect example of how cultivating serenity, even by accident, can trigger that sudden insight.
Her backstory is just one of unimaginable tragedy.
She lost her entire family, one after another, in these horrific events. She was literally driven mad by grief before she found the Sangha. But her awakening moment didn't come from studying philosophy. It happened while she was doing a simple chore. She was washing her feet, and she was just watching the water flow from high ground to low ground.
How did that mundane act trigger it?
It was the simple, predictable, repetitive flow of the water, high to low, high to low. It gave her mind a focal point. And that simple observation caused her mind to become serene, like a fine thoroughbred steed. It was in that moment of perfect calm and stability that she instantly saw the truth of impermanence in everything, and she was liberated.
The blueprint holds true. Focused awareness leads to serenity, which leads to insight.
It does. And finally, you have the almost terrifying commitment of Sumedha. Her story shows the absolute, uncompromising resolve you need to really prioritize this path.
She was the young noblewoman who refused an arranged marriage to a king.
Yes. And to convince her parents, she launches into this graphically unromantic description of the human body. She calls it a hollow carcass, full of saliva, tears, feces, and pus. A total rejection of the body as an object of desire.
And when her parents still wouldn't let her become a nun.
She threatened to starve herself to death. She said she would rather die than be bound by worldly duty and sensual attachment. That level of determination is just stunning. She imagined having 300 sharp swords fall on her body every day for 100 years, and said that would be preferable to the misery and trouble of sensual pleasures, which she called a terrible poison.
And her family was so shocked by her resolve that they finally gave in.
They did, and she very quickly realized the third fruit of the path. Sumedha and all these other nuns in the Theragatha, they give us this direct, unfiltered window into the minds of that first liberated generation. They were proud, determined, and scientifically focused on dismantling their own suffering using the precise blueprint the Buddha gave them.
They used their bodies, their emotions, their pasts as the raw material for their own liberation.
Precisely.
Okay, we have covered a huge amount of ground today, from
Wow.
a cosmic scale all the way down to the personal triumphs of these incredible women.
We really have. From eons of suffering to the microscopic mechanics of consciousness, and finally celebrating the individuals who use that knowledge to get free.
So let's try to synthesize this. Let's review the 3 most valuable, actionable nuggets that we've pulled from this deep dive into the foundational texts.
Okay, first I think is the clarification of the sequence of practice. The critical realization that real success on the path demands cultivating serenity samadhi, or jhana, as the necessary precursor to true insight.
Which means understanding that mindfulness in daily life, Sampajanya, is the preparatory work. It's the ethical foundation that you need to support the deep, formal, immersive practice.
Exactly. The progression is non-negotiable. Morality leads to concentration, which then leads to wisdom.
Okay, nugget number 2.
The profound philosophical clarity you get from the dependent origination model once you define the terms precisely. We move past these vague spiritual ideas to see choices sahara as that intentional conditioning momentum.
Right, and craving tacha as the raw, primal instinct for sense experience, and then grasping upadana as that more sophisticated intellectual attachment to views and self-theories that really fuels the next life.
And finally, number 3, just the undeniable power of the early nuns' voices from the Theragatha. They stand as this monumental proof of spiritual equality.
Confidently pushing back against cosmic tempters like Mara, as Soma did, and against social limitations.
And using their own aging bodies and difficult lives, as Ambapali did, as the very confirmation of the Buddha's teaching. They prove that when the mind is purified and stable, gender is simply immaterial to liberation.
So whether we're talking about the aggregates, the forces of rebirth, or the body of a retired courtesan, all of this knowledge seems to point to one radical goal: the complete abandonment of the illusion of self, seeing everything as conditioned, as suffering, and ultimately as empty, vacuous, hollow, insubstantial.
That's the destination. The highest state of liberation, the unshakable release of the heart, is defined in the texts as being empty of greed, hate, and delusion. So if these 5 core components of our experience, form, feeling, perception, choices, and consciousness, are all fundamentally impermanent and not self, then what's left?
If Soma, in her moment of triumph, no longer saw herself as a woman, but just saw this conditioned process unfolding, what is the experience of the I that remains?
And that's the provocative thought we want to leave you with. This path demands relentless practice in seeing everything, this body, this mind, all of reality, as conditioned and utterly empty of a self. What does living entirely free of I-making, mind-making, and conceit actually feel like?
And how does that unshakable release, which is said to transcend all conditioned existence, function in a world that is still made up of these 5 perishable aggregates? It's a massive philosophical question.
And one that requires the steady, serene mind that the blueprint prescribes in order to even begin to investigate it.
A profound question for contemplation to lead you to your next deep dive.
Until then, keep digging into those sources.
We'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.